This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the BSI Press. Manuscripts, collections of papers by international writers, and books covering a wide range of other Sherlockian topics. Find them online at BakerStreetIrregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the problem was final, the house was empty, and his bow was last, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Why would the Pope engage Sherlock Holmes' services? Why did he receive the Legion of Honor from France? And why would he refuse a knighthood?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 194, The Ladies of Title. Well, gracious and good afternoon, or good evening, or good morning, depending on when and where you are joining us. Welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast, where we look at some of the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, if I were to give you a title, what would your preferred title be?
Well, I have two answers for that. One is my current favorite, which is Strange Lightnings Glitter in His Eyes. I think I like that. But I used to always like to refer to that old movie, The Wind and the Lion, in which Sean Connery's character always would occasionally introduce himself or be introduced as Muley Ahmed Mohammed El Raizuli the Magnificent, Sultan to the Berbers. And if I could fit all that on a business card, I would.
Well, that's easy for you to say. This is episode 194 of Trifles, and that means you can find the show notes for this episode at ihose.co/trifles194. And you can find us on most major social networks as I Hear of Sherlock. If you'd like to mail us in a comment, we are trifles@ihearofsherlock.com. And, of course, we encourage you to comment on the show and tell people about it on your favorite platform. And if you can, leave us a review. We've seen some ratings, some reviews coming in lately, and we do appreciate that. And we know the show has been getting wider play. So let's bring the whole world to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere's Trifles podcast, as you are listening to it now. Well, we promised you we would bring you Ladies of Title. This is the third in our series under the Sherlock Holmes, Mr. Sherlock Holmes the Theorist series that we've got, where we look at past bits of scholarship and bring them forward to discuss. This is the third in the Women of the Canon series from the Sherlock Holmes Journal. And this is another article by Pat Dalton. Pat, of course, joined us as Patsy Dalton in, I think, the Working Girls episode, which was, I think that was episode 190. Just 4 episodes ago. And so this comes to us from Volume 10, Number 3 of the Sherlock Holmes Journal. So, Women of the Canon, the Ladies of Title. Where should we start? There's so many ladies in the Sherlock Holmes stories.
Well, Pat Dalton starts in her essay by pointing out that the first half of the 20th century turned its ladies into women. And so she begins by actually talking about what connotes the appellation of a lady. Pat Dalton points out Watson was a product of his day, and he knew a lady from a woman. So when a working girl came his way, he was able to tell, as she puts it, whether she would marry into ladyhood or dwindle into womanhood. But the world was changing. And one of her first examples is Mrs. Neville St. Clair, who Pat Dalton points out would have been a brewer's daughter who was fortunate enough to marry into the professional classes. So to the doctor, to Watson, she was a little blonde woman who was, for better or worse, the wife of a well-heeled adventurer. And she had, by means of a changing language, become a sort of lady. But for all her rectitude, she was a woman. Now, I found that interesting, I guess, because to me, those words, lady, woman, even though, I'm deeply familiar with these stories, when I think of Mrs. Neville St. Clair, I must admit that description, that classification, that stratification escapes me completely.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting discernment here because, I mean, today they're certainly interchangeable, but I found a reference. I mean, everybody knows the famous line, the throwaway line that Henny Youngman used to use. Take my wife, please. There was a citation earlier than that I'm finding from Bartlett's. It says, meanwhile, one can imagine the pride that the editors felt in managing to add with precise citation to an 1887 vaudeville routine by Joseph Weber and Lou Fields, which went like this. Who was that lady I saw you with last night? Yeah, she ain't no lady. She's my wife. They were already getting the discernment between lady and woman and wife, whatnot. So it's interesting to see this kind of social revolution that was taking place in the late 1800s.
Well, it's interesting because Pat Dalton in her essay is on her way to associating ladies, obviously, with the title of lady. And that's where we'll spend most of her she spends most of her time in the essay, in which we're going to talk about. But, I guess as an American who isn't sort of unconscious on a daily level I don't feel that I'm unconscious on a daily level on class. The idea that, and I guess it struck me because I don't think of Mrs. Neville St. Clair in that way. Well, she wasn't a lady. She was a little blonde woman, just the wife of somebody else. I found this interesting. And then, of course, Pat Dalton goes on and says, and just like that, just like Mrs. Neville St. Clair was Mrs. Grant Monroe. The doctor referred to her, she says, in the new, loose meaning of the word as a lady. But Pat Dalton says, really, she was a woman. A nice woman, a well-mannered woman, a good upstanding middle-class London W1 sort of woman, but not a lady. Ladies did not marry American lawyers or dodge about Norbury in the dead of night. She married quite nicely both times, and we're delighted her prosperous second husband took her daughter to his heart, but she was not out of the top drawer.
Yeah, see, she's no lady. She's Grant Monroe's wife.
Yeah. But for a really cracking start, says Pat Dalton, there's Lady Hilda Trelawney Hope, youngest daughter of the Duke of Belminster, of delicate charm and beautiful coloring, honoring the modest Baker Street apartment with a morning visit. And when I read this in Pat Dalton's essay, I thought of Mary Morstan's first appearance in, and I don't remember in this particular. Oh, no, that's one of the things that struck me. In this essay, she doesn't get to Mary Morstan. But see, now when Mary Morstan appears, and I suppose by this definition, one would not think of Mary Morstan as a lady. But boy, that description, Watson's note of how she's attired, the details of her dress, the care with which she's assembled it, her own brilliance, her own Mary Morstan was more articulate than I am. That whole scene. How could Mary Morstan not be a lady? Well, Watson certainly is quite taken with her, as we all should be. But for Lady Hilda Trelawney Hope, Pat Dalton says, she sweeps about clasping and unclasping her white-gloved hands, queenly, intensely womanly, in the nicest sense of the word, and even betraying her breeding by a show of emotion. It's impossible, she says, on reading this nonsense to ignore the fact that Watson is making a fool of himself.
And she says when Lady Hilda play acts, she does it so badly that even Constable Macpherson seems faintly aware of an unsuitable air of gentility. She would have been something of a traitor to her generation if she had not taken advantage of the new permissiveness and achieved a youthful indiscretion.
Yes, and then Pat Dalton quotes Felix Morley. She says, she gives, regrettably, every sign of being an elegant and slightly dishonest nincompoop. Or, as Dr. Felix Morley described her, a perfect boob.
Hey now.
Thus, incidentally furnishing us with a perfect example of the constant change in the meaning of words. How about that? But then Pat Dalton says, does a lady have to be a nincompoop? And, well, obviously the answer to that is no. But again, you look at the people that you're encountering in the canon. She says, Lady Frances Carfax is a good lady of no sense. She had taken refuge from her loneliness in her faith, but to no real purpose. Didn't really alleviate her isolation. She was probably regarded by the people around her as a lost soul.
And there was an episode where we talked with Maria Konnikova on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. I think it was all the way back on, I think it was episode 91? Yeah, 91, The Confidence Game, where we talked about what it is that makes people gullible and why we are taken advantage of by con men. And it seems like Lady Frances would have fit the profile extremely well. Lonely, drifting, looking for some sort of companionship, some sort of certainty. And along came Reverend Schlesinger and took great advantage of this poor woman, this poor lady.
Yes.
So, well, let's continue with this conversation about ladies of title right after this quick word. Yes, we're in the middle of one of those Mr. Sherlock Holmes the Theorist episodes of Trifles, where we're looking at a classic piece of Sherlockian scholarship. Well, where can you find classic Sherlockian scholarship? Well, there are a couple of places, and we can think of one of them right off the bat that's available right now. It's The Grand Game, Volume 2, which contains Sherlockian scholarship from a variety of sources, mostly the Baker Street Journal, from 1960 to 2010. Volume 2 is all that's left because Volume 1 was so popular, it sold out. We'll have more news on bringing Volume 1 back from the dead in future episodes, but for now, get on over to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and pick up your copy of Volume 2 of The Grand Game, covering the last half-century of Sherlockian scholarship. You won't find better work in a single volume anywhere else. Go to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and get The Grand Game Volume 2 today. Hey, nice lady! Hey, we're back. I couldn't resist. Hey, pretty lady. We are talking about the ladies of title here in the Sherlock Holmes canon. Lady Frances Carfax, Lady Hilda Trelawney Hope. These are a couple of the ladies whose titles actually are part of their names. Who else do we have in that vein that we might recognize?
Well, I never think of the Duchess of Holderness, but Pat Dalton dismisses her pretty effectively in a sentence. She says, apart from good sense, we know little of her qualities. Her own son seems to have been fond of her, but then children have been known to like their mothers, whether they were ladies or not. So that's really all she has to say about the Duchess of Holderness. But she's got a lot to say about Clotilde Lothman von Saxe-Meiningen, the second daughter of the King of Scandinavia, the soul of delicacy and brought up in the strict principles of her family, a princess of the 19th century, farmed out to the monarchies of Europe, destined to found dynasties. A well-brought-up Nordic beauty who could cool off the hot blood of Middle European monarchs, whose claim to be true blue royalty was somewhat suspect. Clotilde had a good trickle of Teutonic blood mixed with the Viking, was good on the domestic side, of a good pedigree. She may have been a good and faithful consort to Wilhelm Gottsreich Sigismund von Ormstein, the hereditary king of Bohemia. Or she may, on the other hand, have led him a pretty dance and ended up writing a scandalous memoir about her life in Bohemia. Now, there's a case where Pat Dalton has created a whole character out of a footnote. And I really like that. She may have led him a pretty dance and ended up writing a scandalous memoir.
Yeah, there's so much fuel there for a potential story, whether it's a short story or a full-length book. I would read that.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. We get a little closer to the shores of England when we talk about Lady Eva Brackwell. Well, this, of course, is one of the victims in Charles Augustus Milverton. Pat Dalton writes that her imprudent letters may have been no more than that, just imprudent. But the mere fact that they existed as evidence of secret assignations or of a premarital affection for someone unsuitable would have been sufficient to condemn her in the eyes of an intolerant fiancé. And society, unfortunately, would not have sided with the lady. Now, her very innocence contributed to her dilemma. She was unable to cope with the situation without outside help.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And Pat Dalton says, she was the most beautiful debutante of her season, and her predicament would have touched the heart more deeply than that of others. And I like that. Again, she's imbuing Lady Eva Brackwell with, I think, more of a personality and position than we actually glean from the story, but I like that. Yeah. But Pat Dalton contrasts her with the person she calls the Dark Lady of the little gleaming revolver. What a woman she was, she says, the avenger of wrongs, the killer of Milverton, widow of one of the noblest gentlemen who ever lived. And it's not necessary to know her name. And a lot of people have, some people have tried to associate her with Winston Churchill's mother, Jenny Jerome. But Pat Dalton says she was probably of foreign extraction because few English ladies of the time were possessed of revolvers or the skill and courage needed to use them.
Interesting. Well, then again, vengeance is a powerful motivator, and this lady may have had access to her husband's collection, so we'll never know, unfortunately.
Yeah. And then Pat Dalton goes on, there's many other really interesting female characters, some of whom we'll encounter in other essays in this series, but Isadora Klein does not command the same sympathy, but she commands our admiration and respect. And even though at the moment of her meeting with Sherlock Holmes, she did not bear any title, it's likely that she had done so in the past through her Spanish ancestors and would do so again through a judicious marriage. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. And here the piece turns in a surprising direction, I thought, and that is in the direction of Irene Adler. She is not a lady of title, at least not of any assigned title that we know of in the canon. She, of course, is a former opera singer. She is an erstwhile romantic target of the King of Bohemia. But she doesn't hold a title herself, but she is, as Pat Dalton puts it, in competition with such a successful adventuress as the artistic Isadora. The lady defeated Sherlock Holmes every bit as successfully, for one can assume that the £5,000 would have not meant more than a passing pang to her, and she had the distinction of doing so face to face. Neatly contrived escape for Isadora, but a brazenly explicit self-justification. So an interesting kind of dichotomy there between these two adventuresses and their position in society.
Well, yes, too, but I think that one of the things Pat Dalton was trying to get to in that paragraph, and I think that she didn't particularly get to it clearly enough, is that Irene Adler holds the greatest title of all because Holmes called her the woman.
Yeah, I get it. I get that.
And that's, I think, what Pat Dalton was trying to get to.
Yeah, I mean, in Holmes's world, having his respect and admiration would have been a greater title or a greater estimation than any kind of inherited or married into title.
Yeah.
Undoubtedly.
And then we're on sort of to the end of Pat Dalton's great essay here. Nothing too ladylike could be expected of Hattie Duran, who almost became Lady Robert St. Simon. And by missing out on that, she missed out on a remote nursery in a country house in the Shires and a cold schoolroom in Belgravia. Instead, her nursery was the Californian mountains, her schoolroom a mining camp. Marrying her own choice, living on intimate terms with her maidservant, and ditching her noble bachelor with never a backward glance. Slangy tomboy that she was. I love that description. She would never have done for Lord St. Simon, though her money, her open manner, and her fine disregard of the conventions might have done the House of Balmoral more good than it deserved.
That's wonderful. Well, and finally we get to another foreign-born lady, and that is Mary Fraser, who became Sir Eustace Brackenstall's wife, Lady Mary. And Pat says, to be fair to her, she might, in fact, have proved to be beautiful and dainty had the gentleman been more congenial. But though admittedly more sinned against than sinning, the lady's character does not bear analysis. It's one thing to be sensitive and high-spirited, but it's quite another to claim these qualities for oneself. She assured Holmes that to be with such a man as Sir Eustace for even an hour was unpleasant, yet she married him. And with her free and unconventional upbringing in Australia, it's certain that she spent a great deal more than an hour in his company before accepting him. So, although one assumes that he was on his best behavior, sweet as honey, in fact, during the 6-month courtship, she is most likely guilty of exaggeration. Pat writes, angry and distressed as she was, the perfect lady would have mentioned that it was only in drink that her husband was a fiend.
Yeah, well, at the end, Pat Dalton sort of forgives Lady Brackenstall. She says, her anger and horror are kind of forgivable. Her self-dramatization, her railing against the law of the country as it applied to herself, another echo of the unfairness of some of the laws of the day. Her irritation with the kind of life she had married into, and the fact admitted by her loyal old nurse that she'd been attracted by a title into a loveless marriage. All this doesn't endear her to the reader. And she ends her little exploration of Lady Brackenstall here by saying it's to be hoped that Captain Crocker was eventually able, without recourse to violence, of which she had unquestionably had enough, to knock some sense, into her beautiful, empty head.
Well, and that leaves me to wonder, in that kind of arrangement, Lady Brackenstall, there's no indication that she and Sir Eustace had any children together, would have inherited the Brackenstall estate. Would Captain Crocker have given up his nautical career at that point, his maritime career? Would he have settled down for a life in the country and become a country gentleman as a consort to Lady Brackenstall? Or would the lady have chucked it all away for, round-the-world cruises with Captain Crocker on various sailing vessels?
Well, that is a deeply speculative subject that seems to me to be worthy of both more exploration at some future time, as well as the observation that, oh, come on, it's only a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes. And he always will. Come on, Coffee.